Elizabeth A. Sewell is the Associate Director of BYU's International Center for Law and Religion Studies. She joined the law school in 2000, was previously an associate with the Appellate and Supreme Court Practice Group of Meyer, Brown, and Platt in Washington, D.C., where she researched and drafted briefs in federal and state courts of appeal and in the United States Supreme Court. From 1997 to 1998, she was a judicial clerk for Judge J. Clifford Wallace in the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit, and she was a legal intern in the Department of Churches at the Ministry of Culture in the Czech Republic. Her publications are numerous, and I'll refer you to her bio on the flyer, but as you can imagine, dealing with issues of religious liberty and religious freedom. She received her degrees in comparative literature in Russian, doesn't say where, from Brigham Young University, and received her law degree summa cum laude from Brigham Young University, where she was the editor-in-chief of the BYU Law Review. Today she's going to be speaking on contemporary issues affecting international religious freedom. This is obviously an era of great interest and significance to us as Latter-day Saints and as people of faith. But as you may not know, it is a very important area in the domain of international law. And so we very much appreciate Ms. Sewell's time and her willingness to come and speak to us today. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Sewell.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome and the introduction. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak here today. Freedom of religion has expanded dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years around the world. And in the time we have today, I'd like to discuss a little bit about how that came about and some of the remaining challenges that we face. Secularism has been the predominant thesis, the predominant approach of much of the late 20th century. There's an assumption that the state was going to wither away, either because of anti-religious ideologies such as communism, or because of a sense that religion is becoming increasingly irrelevant in the world, sort of Fukuyama's end of history idea, that we have the triumph of democratic ideals and religion is no longer a major player. These assumptions were also based empirically on at least what was happening in Western Europe, where society has become increasingly secular. But empirical studies and plain reality have shown that that's not happening. Major theorists have had to recant and say, no, the world is becoming desecularized indeed. There's a sense of resurgence of what can be called public religion in the public sphere. We see this in different areas. Depending on what your specialty is, you'll recognize some of them. In the U.S. context, it may be charitable choice initiatives or concerns about posting the Ten Commandments. In Latin America, you see it in the growth of Protestants, particularly Pentecostals, that have a dramatic growth in the last 20 years or so. In the Islamic world, you see women and girls wanting to wear headscarves where before that was never culturally required. But now it's considered an assertion of sort of Muslim identity. You see this in Indonesia or Pakistan, for example. In the Orthodox world, Romania, Russia, Belarus, governments have tried to increase their ties with Orthodoxy or set up Orthodoxy as the national religion. In India, the neo-Hindu nationalist party, the BJP party, has had tremendous success. As you see throughout the world, there's an insistence that religion should play a part in the public sphere and becomes very contentious sometimes. So what's causing this growth of public religion? Well, there's many reasons. A few just to touch on is a reaction to a globalization, assertion of identity. It's been said that globalization breaks down barriers of polity and culture, but also prompts movements to reassert identities and self-determination. In the face of an onslaught of similar consumerism, for example, people want to show something about themselves that is unique and will draw on their own culture and religion. Another way of looking at it is seeing that there's a vacuum left after the fall of secularism. Secularism's critique of pre-modern orthodoxies was that they were unstable, unempirical, meta-narratives, to use the postmodernist world, that they had tried to have complete control over the way people thought. In its own way, secularism did that too. And now that itself has been undercut. And so we have a world where secularism has to jockey for power with different religions. And some of these previous dominant groups are now trying to reassert themselves, trying to retake their place that they had 100 years ago. What's interesting in this postmodern context is the question of how religion itself has changed in reactions. If you look around, you'll notice, and many scholars have commented on the growth of non-denominational or non-traditional spirituality. People, if you go to the bookstores, you'll see lines of books talking about sort of pop spirituality or eclectic or syncretic beliefs. People who are trying to find something spiritual, but not necessarily turning to mainline religions. I mean, many of you are familiar with the fact that the LDS Church has become the 5th largest church denomination in the United States. If you look at what it's displaced, however, you'll see it's some of the more mainline churches, Episcopalianism, Methodism. They're losing some of the hold that they had. This rise of public religion and religion in the public sphere is a bit of a curse and a blessing. It opens room for religious freedom. There's more public interest in religion. There's more space for different beliefs and recognition of its prominence in reality and individual lives. People are taking into account in foreign policy in ways that they never did before. But the growth of public religion has also brought out some very controversial movements. And probably the one that people think of most clearly is some of the more extreme Islamic movements. We'll address some of the challenges that come, but first look at how religious freedom has blossomed through the loosening up of some of the previously dominant ideologies. And then we'll have hopefully some time for questions and discussion at the end. First major change that opened up room for religious freedom is the Second Vatican Council, 1963-1965. We think of this in terms of all the changes in the Catholic liturgy, changes in style, changes in emphasis. One part of it that you may not be aware of was a document called Dignitatis Humanae, or the dignity of man, that changed the Catholic position that for nearly 2,000 years had been that that the sovereign or the government should be a Catholic sovereign. This changed that and said, no, we respect the right of religious freedom, and it's important for the state not to be solely Catholic, but to allow room for other people to have their beliefs. This had tremendous impact in predominantly Catholic countries, such as Spain, Italy, Latin America, and so forth. You'll just see here briefly how the numbers of non-Catholics in Latin America skyrocketed from 1960, when it was 4%, to 2000, 16%. In some countries, I've been told, in Chile, for example, it's 25%. This is something that couldn't have happened before Vatican II, I believe. So what's happened if you examine a little more closely, is that historically, in historically Catholic countries, the Catholic Church had a privileged relationship that was formed in what was called a concordat, or a legal agreement between the country and the Holy See, which is a country itself, the country where the Vatican is located. And so this international treaty established certain privileges for the Catholic Church. After Vatican II, there's been some question about how do we change that? Do we try and lower the privileges the Catholic Church has? Do we raise other churches up? In general, the response has been to raise other churches up, at least most of the way. In Spain and Italy, the government has entered into additional concordats with other groups of religions. In Spain, for example, there's an agreement with the Protestant Federation and the Jewish Federation and the Muslim Federation. Problems that creates, however, is that once you've entered into agreements with the major denominations, which say comprise 90% of the population, 95, 97% of the population, there's very little political will to enter into additional agreements. These often have to go through Parliament. They're international treaties. They have to be ratified. And so for the smaller groups, that leaves them out. In some countries, they've put in additional implementing legislation trying to raise the level of other religious groups, or at least allow them to have some of the privileges the Catholic Church had before, things that we take for granted in the United States, being able to deduct charitable contributions from your taxes, being able to have chaplains if you're in the military, things that may not be entirely vital to your survival as a religion, but are a significant part of religious freedom, the freedom to manifest in your beliefs. Essentially, what's come in both Catholic countries and in typically Protestant countries is a two-tier system, or in Italy it's a three-tier system actually, where you have either the religions with concordats or the state religions formally accepted by the states, or in Germany they're called public law corporations, at one level, and then you'll have some kind of legal status for other religions. This opens questions of discrimination and how do you divide between the two tiers. In Eastern Europe, some countries have tried to move to this two-tier system, and it's been very controversial. How do you do this? Do you only allow religions that are deeply rooted in your country to have this higher status? Do you allow all groups that have a certain number of members to have this status? As a practical matter, you can understand where they're coming from. These are systems that have much more cooperation of the state with religions. They have state-owned media, and so they have to decide which religions do they allow to have access to the state-owned media. They have a fair amount of state control over education and other areas. And so they want to cooperate with religions, but there's a limit to how much the state feels it can. In some of the cases, I'm moving forward a little too fast here. In some cases, there's been legal challenges to this. In Germany, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses were denied this higher level status of Körperschaft öffentlichen Rechts, or public law corporation, because they had conscientious objection to military service. Because in Germany, the status was that you had to have respect for the state. And they claimed, well, if you're not willing to serve in the military, you don't have respect for the state, therefore we shouldn't grant you this higher tier status. The Jehovah's Witnesses took it to the German Constitutional Court and won, and that provision is no longer enforced. But some of these do translate over to other parts of the world. Lithuania, you have to have been there 25 years. Well, if you think about where Lithuania was 25 years ago, you can think about how many churches were there 25 years ago. In Russia, that's been an issue that's been debated, and there's current legislation now. I'll get to that later. This issue always keeps coming up. On to the next sort of major series of events that have provided for religious freedom in the world. If you think of opening up of previous ideological domains, certainly one is the Catholic world. Another one was the communist world. The end of the Soviet era in East Europe has created an enormous amount of space for religious freedom. Religious groups, religious believers are enabled to practice and to spread their beliefs in ways that were unthinkable 30 years ago, 20 years ago. All right, well, let's see if I can get the laser pointer to work right, the clicker to work right. Immediately after the fall of communism, constitutions were revamped. They put in grand-sounding provisions that allowed for freedom of religion or belief. And indeed, there was a fair amount of legislation, and there was a fair amount of openness, allowing groups to come in, to proselyte, to have legal entity status. This openness has had repercussions elsewhere in the world that we don't tend to think of when we think of the fall of communism. Many other places, such as Africa or Southeastern Asia, have places that were client states of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, their own ties to power and ties to secularism fell. And so in these countries, too, now there's increased openness and willingness to accommodate religious beliefs. What, of course, has not dramatically changed is the few remaining secular totalitarian states, such as China. And these are some of the major problems of religious freedom today. I'm not going to touch on them in great depth, but people being jailed for their beliefs, sent to labor camps, not allowed to organize, not allowed to meet. Certainly the most dramatic and horrific examples of lack of religious freedom continue on in these secular communist regimes. But moving back to the parts of the post-communist world, what happened there? Well, the early openness led to reaction. I don't know how many of you have spent any time in Eastern Europe, but I was there. I was in Czechoslovakia in 1991, same time they were having 1990. They're having their first presidential election. I was there for the election. I was there for the inauguration of President Havel as first president. People were thrilled to meet Americans, were fascinated by new ideas. I was an LDS missionary in Czechoslovakia shortly thereafter. People were fascinated. They wanted to know more. They hadn't been allowed to learn about God and were curious about what one could know about God and what other beliefs were out there. If you go back now to different parts, and I traveled extensively in Eastern Europe in the last 10 years, that's changed. There's still interest and curiosity, but there's a wariness, there's a sense that we've been invaded by foreign beliefs and that our own culture needs to be upheld. This sense of preserving one's own culture, preserving one's own belief, has come into fore. And there's been a reaction in the legal field as well that's limited religious freedom. You can also trace some of this to historical roots, where in the Byzantine world, this sense of Caesaropapism, the emperor outranks the pope or patriarch, and that this belief of what they called symphonia, that the church and the state should work together in harmony, has led many to still feel that orthodoxy should be different than other Western beliefs, that it has its own canonical territory and no other Christian churches should be within its canonical territory. There's been large debates, I don't know if you've heard about it, with the Pope, Pope John Paul II, who wanted to travel to Russia, wasn't allowed to because of pressure from the Orthodox Church, which was very strong against the Catholic Church, seeing the Catholic priests and bishops on the territory of Russia as so-called poaching, because they were invading the canonical territory of the Orthodox Church. Fear of Western proselytism. There's a fear that they're part of the CIA. There's a fear that Westerners are better funded than we are, and they're going to come and invade our country and take over our culture, sort of along the lines of fear of McDonald's that you see in other parts of the world. It's just all gets lumped together. What there also is that we don't think of very often when we think of hostility to Western groups in this part of the world is there's even more fear of splinter groups from their own dominant religions. As harsh as some of the post-communist governments have been towards Western religions, they save their worst forms of legal repression for break-offs of their own church. Orthodoxies that aren't Orthodox churches that don't follow. So in Russia, it's the Moscow Patriarchy that is the lead player, or non-official Islam when you're in Central Asia. There's a famous case where in Moldova they refused to register the Bessarabian Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church that looked to Romania instead of looking to Russia, which angered it, which created problems with the policy of the government at the time. And so politics gets overlapped here. And so eventually it was taken to the European Court of Human Rights, and political pressure was put on Moldova to recognize the church. But it took a good 10 years, 15 years, before they would recognize this alternate Orthodox church. All right, onward and forward. One of the main ways that you see this happening is something very prosaic, that you think, oh, you're just being a lawyer. This is legal stuff that's not interesting and not relevant. But if you actually look at where the rubber meets the road, so to say, where the problems come, they'll show up in this very simple legal form of registration laws. In most countries in the world, including the United States, to do business, you need to have a legal entity. In the United States, it's fairly simple. You put down a couple names, you pay $25, same day forms are filed, and you're fine, you're a legal entity. In the communist world, this was used as a means for controlling religions. For example, in Czechoslovakia, the registration law required that all churches submit the names of anyone they were going to ordain to a post within the church for clearance by the government. This habit of control has continued, and so registration now not only is needed for legal entity status, to open bank accounts and rent property and sort of mundane things like that, but also to invite in foreign workers or to have ministry in any of the public sphere, religions or prisons, hospitals, in some cases to avoid police surveillance. These registration laws are in flux. Currently we're involved with our center and working on some draft laws in Romania, Russia, where else? Serbia. And these are ones that within the last 2 or 3 years we've been involved in. They're constantly changing. This is just an area that is not settling down. There's enough concerns on both sides about what the role of religion should be, what the role of foreign religion should be, that this is something that won't settle down for quite some time. On to the next area. In addition to the opening up of religious freedom from the fall of communism, from the loosening up of the Catholic Church, we see not only a growth of the LDS Church, which I'm sure you follow, but groups all across the spectrum. In fact, one thing that has grown dramatically that raises additional challenges and concerns for religious freedom is groups called so-called cults or sects. If you know most European languages, sect is the derogatory term and cult is the neutral term. In English, cult is the derogatory term and sect is the neutral term. So just be careful whether you admit you're a member of a sect or not. This sect or cult phenomenon has shown up in heavy press coverage of some violence associated with new religious movements. You may be familiar with the Heaven's Gate mass suicide or the standoff at Waco, the Aum Shinrikyo gassing in the Tokyo subway. There's a massacre by the Church of the Ten Commandments in Uganda. There's been some others, but they receive massive publicity. People become very scared, very concerned. This is sort of the thing that you worry about your child joining. There are a number of sociologists who've been studying this phenomenon, and there's a lot of things that could be said. Very interesting field, actually, which attracts some very interesting people. That's another question. That's another point. You ought to meet some of these sociologists who study new religious movements. At any rate, they're fascinating. But their general approach has been to say that some groups are violent, but most are not. That there's much churning among members. People will join a group and then join another one and join another one. Most will leave a group after a year or two. And one of the sociologists I know, Eileen Barker, Order of the British Empire in Britain, has decided that she's had enough fun studying sects and cults, and now she studies the anti-sect movement, because what this group of sects and cults has led to is a very active anti-sect movement that is trying to harass them out of existence. There's certainly real concerns, but there tends to be an approach to broad brush to put all minority religious groups in this field. As a scholarly matter, they tend to be called new religious movements or minority religious movements. NRMs is the standard term rather than sects or cults, just because of all the connotations that come with those. In the United States, we had a fair amount of this going on in the 1980s and 90s. Deprogramming or brainwashing controversies. Someone would claim that their child had been brainwashed, by this so-called cult. They would find someone who was a professional deprogrammer. Okay. Well, it must be the attack of the cults coming and getting my PowerPoint presentation. The so-called deprogrammers would forcibly kidnap the person who had been so-called brainwashed, would lock them up in a small house somewhere in the country for 3 or 4 days, and put them on water rations or bread and water, something along those lines, and sometimes beat them in order to try to get them to give up their beliefs. Now, they probably felt this was justified. They probably felt that something similar had happened on the other end to get this person to join a sect or cult. But at any rate, the way it played out in the legal field tends to be that the individual, who is usually an adult, who chose to join this new religious movement, sues the person who kidnapped them and deprogrammed them. And then the deprogrammer uses as a defense, well, you were brainwashed, I had to do this. That hasn't stood up very well in courts. It hasn't stood up very well in the scholarly world. It doesn't seem to be holding it very well on the PowerPoint either. Let's see. All right, we'll keep moving along. Interesting story about the Cult Awareness Network. Come back here. There we go. All right, well, we may need to do this without a PowerPoint. At any rate, the Cult Awareness Network, this is just a fun story, was a group that referred people to deprogrammers. Because they referred some people to individuals that they knew were convicted felons, they were brought in and sued as well by some of these individuals who had been deprogrammed. And they also were sued by libel by the Church of Scientology. At any rate, they lost spectacularly and were bankrupt. And then the Church of Scientology bought their name, Cult Awareness Network, and their website out of bankruptcy. And so now there's the new Cult Awareness Network, which is run by the Church of Scientology. The anti-sect, anti-cult movement has moved on to Europe and other parts of the world. In Europe, you've seen over the last 10, 20 years a group of sect commissions formed to study this so-called phenomena of sects. Sect lists, particularly in France and in Belgium. In France, it was created by an interministerial commission, 168 groups. In Belgium, there was approximately 190 groups that included the Southern Baptists and Opus Dei. There's the problem with these lists is they tend to get used and passed around in other parts of the world and used by lower level officials as an excuse to deny someone access to an otherwise neutral and open government program. For example, Hare Krishnas in many parts of France, or in all parts of the world, run this Bread for Food program where they give food to homeless. And they were denied the opportunity of participating with the French government because they showed up on a sect list. There are police lists. There's lists created by religious groups. Thank you. Oh, I'm going backwards. There's commissions centered. Most of the countries that have studied this issue, that created a commission to study the issue, have looked at it and said, well, there's a few groups that have been harmful, but on the whole, there's nothing we can do as a government besides the laws that we have in force already against murder and suicide and fraud and those kinds of things. A few countries have gone a little further, France and Belgium in particular. France passed an anti-sect law in 2001 that originally tried to criminalize what they called mind control, and they still have a related form of that. This anti-sect law has been modeled and is considered for legislation in other parts of the world. Italy has had a draft one, although it finally got pulled or tabled last fall. There have been some efforts to export to Russia, to Hong Kong. There's just this strong sense in some parts of the world in France, for example, it's not such a problem because there's a strong tradition of legal protections. You can take them to court and so forth. But you transfer some of these same problems of being put on a list that can't be taken off of, and you move that to Russia or to China, and the problems multiply. In addition to the problems of sects and cults and sect lists, sect commissions. One of the other major issues that I just want to touch on briefly is that of Islam in the West. Certainly when people think about public religion, this is one of the areas that's on everyone's mind. I mean, the riots in France, the riots around the world associated with cartoons of Muhammad, September 11th, concerns about Iraq, Afghanistan. The question is, how is this going to be reconciled with the West, with democracy? People have concerns that go to the nature of Islam, and Muslims also have concerns about the Muslims who live in the United States or in Western Europe. This is just sort of a brief overview, for maybe overly simplistic for some of you who studied the area in depth. Just to remind you, the Muslim world extends far beyond the Middle East. In fact, the country with the largest Muslim population is Indonesia. And some of these issues show up elsewhere. And again, just as Muslims are elsewhere among them in the Middle East, Middle Easterners are not necessarily Muslim. Again, this may be obvious to you, but this is an interesting graph showing Arab Americans, the majority of whom are Christian. But when you look at the questions of Islam and secularism, there's some occasions for hope and there's some concerns. Some of the areas that we tend to overlook that are areas are countries that are predominantly Islamic that have a strong secular background. Turkey, Pakistan, Nigeria, Indonesia, Malaysia, post-communist countries, all of Central Asia is traditionally Muslim. Albania is traditionally Muslim. Western Europe and the U.S., there's a number of Muslims living here. I mean, essentially what has happened, you can say, is that Muslims, within the Muslim world, there's, I've heard it described by Muslim scholars as a reformation of sorts going on. There's a clash within the Muslim world of those who want to change and want to be able to adapt to Western secular models and those who don't. And then, of course, the question of Afghanistan and Iraq, what will happen there? There's going to be models of countries that can survive and have some kind of a stable democratic system with a predominantly Muslim base. That's anyone's guess at the moment. Question of Muslims in the West. Problems that show up here often are controversies over wearing the headscarf. In France and in Turkey, there have been attempts to ban headscarves. In France, it was done in the elementary and the public schools, elementary through high school. In Turkey, it was at the college level as well. In Germany, some states have attempted to ban it or fire teachers who wear headscarves. There's far more that could be said about this than I have time for. This is a lecture in and of itself. Questions of secularism and different secularisms in Turkey and France, views of schools, views of what a headscarf symbolizes. Does it symbolize one's own belief? Does it symbolize repression of women? Those are some of the approaches that different people take in these countries. In some ways, these play out the underlying concerns of assimilation. There are 5 million Muslims in France. It's the second largest religious denomination after Catholicism. Other countries in Europe, it's not quite that large, but it's still quite large. And there's concerns about, on both sides, about assimilation. Does this mean we have to give up our identity as Muslims, or does this mean we have to give up our identity as Frenchmen or Germans and so forth? European Court of Human Rights has had some interesting cases, and one of which I'm just going to mention briefly because it goes to a deeper issue, which is compatibility of different forms of Islamic law and democracy. Turkey has had these Islamic parties that have tried to run for power and gain power. And Turkey, as a secular state, regularly just dissolves the parties. For a number of years, it would dissolve the party, and then it would go on, and they'd form a new party, and then they'd dissolve that party, and then the government would dissolve it again. Eventually, one of these made it to, and these regularly made it up to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights said, no, you can't dissolve it. Finally, they said, yes, you can. And this was what's called the Refah Partisi case. That's the Welfare Party was the name of the party. The party advocated the implementation of Sharia, or Islamic law. And the European Court of Human Rights said, well, that's incompatible with the democratic system. And so you're justified in preserving your democratic system by disbanding the group. Well, this goes to the deeper issue of democratic militant democracy. When does a democracy need to be intolerant in order to survive? That's an issue that people are facing in different parts of the world with regards to Islam and democracy. I think it's sort of ironic, however, that the same time the European Court of Human Rights decided that this party was incompatible with democracy, a different version of this party got elected in Turkey and is now the ruling party and has actually been quite moderate and is moving more closely to European Union and joining that than the previous secular governments had. The whole question of Sharia, or Islamic law, in much of the Islamic world, the push to public religion, to reassertion of our identity as Muslims, has one of the tokens they're trying to use to show that, in addition to headscarf, is Islamic law. Should Islamic law be the law of the state? There's a whole body of Islamic law, and it's quite complex. People tend to think about it just in terms of, oh, you chop off your hand if you steal, or you're stoned if you're an adulteress. But there's actually a quite sophisticated version of it, and there's sophisticated traditions of interpretation. But what's happening is that in many states that became secular sort of along a Western military model, Pakistan or Turkey or Nigeria, people who are trying to assert their Muslim identity are going back to Sharia but have lost the sophisticated traditions of interpretation. And so they're trying to re-implement Sharia but do it in a very sort of crude way almost. For example, the death penalty for blasphemy. That has been part of Islamic law. In Pakistan, there's some attempts to implement that and to apply it to non-Muslims, which has never been part of Islamic law. And so you see there's confusion and the problem of a lack of tradition within the Muslim world and conflicts there. Very, very interesting issues, far more there than I can discuss here. But just in summary, and then I'll have some time for questions if there are any, there's been a dramatic growth of religious freedom. This is something that maybe we take for granted, that those who lived a little longer than us, or some of you who've lived a little longer than me, can appreciate. The undermining of some traditional beliefs, as frightening as that can be, has opened the world for alternatives. It has opened up dominant and exclusive regimes of ideas, has left some residual problems, registration, discrimination, issues that we're still fighting with and dealing with. And then there's the problems of the anti-sect movement and Islam in the West as two of the major concerns facing us from this rise in public religion. There's problems with transition and rule to law, problems with stability in countries that also affect religious freedom, but I'm not going to go there. Just in closing, because this is BYU and I appreciate the religious freedom I have here to be able to locate my research in the context of my beliefs, part of the reason that religious freedom, or the real reason that religious freedom is expanding, is because it's necessary for the Lord to accomplish his work. This is one of many references in Doctrine and Covenants and elsewhere where the church is commanded to send forth the elders into the nations which are far off, the islands of the sea, send forth into foreign lands, call upon all nations, first upon the Gentiles and then upon the Jews. And the gospel should be preached to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. The Lord's making this possible in ways that we could never have imagined. And religious freedom is a necessary precondition for this to happen. One can't preach the gospel unless people can change their belief without fear of being killed. If you can't go in and proselyte within a country, if you can't establish a church, if you can't have a visa, we have a very complicated bureaucratic world, and legal protection of religious freedom is essential. I think why does this matter? Well, it matters because of the restoration of the gospel, and it also matters because religious freedom is a true principle. Let's go back here. Joseph Smith has a wonderful statement. If it's been demonstrated I'm willing to die for a Mormon, I'm bold to declare before heaven that I'm just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any denomination. For the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics, or of any other denomination that may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves. It's the love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole of the human race. Religious freedom is a true principle. It's something that, as people who belong to a majority group here in Utah, we need to remember and we need to respect. It's something that's fascinating and important and exciting, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak out here today. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we realize it's a break. If you need to run to class, we won't be offended. But if any of you have a couple of brief questions, we have a few minutes.
Yes.
Can you just explain what...
we've got a roving mic. This is being taped, so they wanted to get you on mic. Sorry. Do we have a mic? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, I apologize. Someone else raised their hand first. You've got the mic. Mm-hmm. Sure. A question about Central Asian countries being in flux and remaining so. Central Asia is a country, are countries where there's a predominant Muslim majority by far. The question is there, how Muslim can the government be? How tolerant can they be of other forms of Islam? There, the problem of splinter groups becomes acute because they're concerned of groups like Al-Qaeda. Hizb ut-Tahrir is another group that they're very concerned about that's trying to promote a unified caliphate, sort of a unified government of all Muslims across the world, but doing so using peaceable means. And because they're coming from this communist mentality of control, there's a very strong desire to have one acceptable Muslim government or Muslim approach. And so they will, and they have done, and they do this in Russia as well, is sort of force a unity among Muslims, which is not part of the religion. Islam is not a hierarchical religion. But they have a single group of acceptable Muslims that the state works with and cooperates with. But the reason I believe it's unstable is because they marginalize any other beliefs, and in many cases make them illegal, throw people in jail. And some of Central Asian countries are very repressive right now. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan have serious problems. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan are much less so, much more open. But even there's a lot of churning, a lot of concerns, because people are afraid of minorities, are afraid of groups like Al-Qaeda, and so they use that as an excuse to clamp down on other beliefs. We've been involved with groups working on legislation in several of those countries. We were in Kyrgyzstan. I was in Kyrgyzstan a couple of years ago. the director of our centers in Uzbekistan right now, or he's flying to Uzbekistan right now to work on trainings with the American Bar Association. But there's just a lot of work still to be done. The sense of pluralism in open society is an idea that's going to take a while to gain root in the post-Soviet world as a whole, but particularly in Central Asia, where there isn't any traditions of sort of democratic pluralism or openness. So, yes.
Right now in Iraq, there are some serious problems with religious conflict going on. Do you think that the U.S.'s kind of template of Western-style democracy can really work with the how deeply ingrained religious beliefs are into the culture and to the government of Iraq? Do you really think that we can make it work over there with the government we have in mind?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting question. That we're not going to see a democracy in Iraq take shape exactly like the democracy here. And anyone who's expecting it to have a First Amendment that looks like ours and acts like ours is unrealistic, to be short. But I think those involved who've been working with the constitutional process over there, even from the U.S. side, recognize that. Both in Iraq, in Afghanistan, we were involved some in advising in the constitutional process in Iraq. There's been a recognition that in these countries that are particularly are prominently Muslim, they will want something in their constitution to reflect that. And will say, I know in the draft constitution, what they came up with was saying that Sharia or Islamic law is one source of law, recognizing that, but not limiting law to that, as sort of a compromise to allow room for pluralism. They also had provisions for religious freedom, but what that means as a practical matter is still obviously going to be worked out. And right now it's a question of stability and survival. But I still have hope that an open society and pluralism is something that can happen even in a traditionally Muslim state, or one that has strong rifts between the Shia and Sunni groups. So that's a matter of great concern. Yes.
I was just curious. You've kind of touched on this a little bit with Kyrgyzstan and with Russia and stuff, but just as a personal interest, just wondering what are some current case studies with the LDS Church and where are they struggling to get like recognition and stuff like this, and what's your experience with that?
Some case examples of groups trying to get registration. My experience is I've worked with a number of different groups. I've watched the LDS Church as well as other minority groups in these countries trying to get registration. In Kazakhstan, it's been pretty straightforward. They actually have a very diverse population, in large part because, it's really interesting, because it was a place of internal exile. And so both going back to the Tsar's era and then under Stalin and elsewhere, they sent groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, a large group of Jehovah's Witnesses to Kazakhstan, large group of German Protestants that lived along the Volga area, all sent to Siberia, sent to Kazakhstan. So they have a very pluralistic society. Their groups have been registered without too much trouble. There's still limitations on proselyting, but fairly minor compared to the other Central Asian countries. Kyrgyzstan, there's been, we've been through different religious affairs groups. There's a council of religious affairs. In most of these countries, there's a group, an official government group that's responsible for religion, and they will be the one to register a religious organization. And they've been very cautious about registering religious groups. They're nominally open to it. We've talked with them. We've worked with them on for different groups' behalf, and they take it under advisement. but don't want to step on any political toes by actually acting on it, because favoring minority groups isn't a politically smart group. It isn't a politically smart action. There's no constituency to support you. In fact, most constituencies will oppose you for doing it. And so they have recognized some groups. I'm trying to think. I believe the Jehovah's Witnesses have been recognized. But Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, forget it. It's even there. That's one of the most repressive countries in the world at the moment. I mean, it divides up with North Korea and China. There's no religious freedom there, but so it varies greatly. Well, thank you very much. Oh, so follow the question.
With your understanding, would you think in 5 years the church will be recognized, or will they just stay cautious forever?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if the church was registered. I can't say for sure. I have one final anecdote, and then I'll close and let you all move on to the rest of your day. In 1988, I was a freshman here at BYU studying Russian, and another eager freshman in my class piped up and asked the professor, who's excited about glasnost and all the things going on in Eastern Europe that seemed to be opening up just a little bit, asked the professor, well, when do you think there'll be missionaries in Russia? And the professor said, oh, not in my lifetime. And sure enough, within 5-10 years, that same professor was a mission president in Moscow. So I don't predict. Oh, there's another question.
Can you just, how familiar are you with religious freedom in China, and what do you expect is going to happen in the next 20 years or so?
Mm-hmm. Religious freedom in China is a problem. It's a major problem. They have very strong controls. They have 5 recognized religions that have to be the heads of which have to be Chinese. They can't have a foreign head, which is a significant problem for, say, the Catholics, as well as for the Latter-day Saints. And so the Catholics, there's an internal patriotic Catholic organization, which is nominally unconnected with Rome. There's been a large group of house churches, so-called, people trying to meet underground, particularly Christians, meeting in unregistered groups, and occasionally the government will crack down on them, arrest and prosecute pastors. Mostly they turn a blind eye to it. At times they talk about expanding registration to let groups like that register, although then the groups are concerned that they're going to, I mean, this is the problem. When you're used to the mentality of a totalitarian state, you don't really want to register because you're giving your name and you're putting yourself up as a target to the state. There's problems with non-registered religions, problems with Falun Gong. It's a traditional sort of folk religion or folk belief that the government is very concerned about and very repressive towards. But as far as the LDS Church goes, again, I could say not in my lifetime, and then I'll turn around and then it'll be 2 years later. I'm not going to speculate. So, thank you.